Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let everybody get rolled in and get situated here. While we're waiting, just a couple of housekeeping items. Your camera and video are, or your camera and video, it's the same thing. Camera and audio are turned off, so we can't see you, we can't hear you if you got noise in the background. Don't have to worry about any of that. This class is being recorded, so if anybody has to leave early or anything like that, or you want to go back and rewatch it, it'll be up on the onX Hunt YouTube channel tomorrow. We'll also send you an email with that link tomorrow evening. If you do have any questions for us, for our panelists tonight, use the Q&A box down below. We'll monitor that and we'll take some time for Q&A towards the end of the class. If you put them in the chat box, it's just harder for us to keep track of them. So the Q&A box is the spot for that. And stick around for the end of the class. We are giving away some onX Hunt waterfowl t-shirts. So we'll be giving away 10 of those. We'll post that link in the chat towards the end of the class. Looks like people are kind of getting in here, so we'll kick this off. My name's Jack. I'm here at the onX office here in Missoula, Montana. I'm joined by Sam Soholt of Public Land Tees and just kind of hunting man about town, and Kyle Daly, Fish and Wildlife Service. Did I have that right, Kyle?
Yes.
Excellent. So we're going to be kind of running through, talking about how conservation is funded in America. We often hear that saying that hunting is conservation, but what does that really mean? What does that actually look like on the ground? So there are many different ways conservation is funded. We're going to talk about two of the oldest conservation funding mechanisms and two of the biggest to this day. We're going to talk about the duck stamp program and the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, more commonly known as the Pittman Robertson Act. So I'm going to just run you through a little bit of the history of those two programs, when they were started, why they were started. So they both originate in the 1930s, in what's kind of commonly called the dirty 30s, right? We've seen images of the Great Dust Bowl, of just the feet and feet of topsoil that we lost due to some poor agricultural practices and other issues in that time period. And coinciding with that, we also had really low wildlife populations, not just because of the major drought there, but because we just kind of come out of this period of westward expansion in America. People have heard the story of the buffalo hunters, the decimation of those herds, but it was really, it was songbirds, it's waterfowl, upland species, deer, pronghorn, just about everything was in dire straits around the turn of the century. And so there'd been efforts put in place. Theodore Roosevelt famously started the Boone and Crockett Club with others in the late 1800s. There'd been movement on this up to this point, but it's really really the late 20s, 1929, the Migratory Bird Conservation Act was signed into law by Herbert Hoover. So that really authorized the federal government to acquire wetlands, waterfowl habitat, help preserve them, but there wasn't a funding mechanism for that. So we have this law in place that's great. We're going to protect, not just waterfowl, but wetland species, which there's hundreds, thousands of species that, plants and animals that rely on wetlands, but there's no money behind that. You're kind of limited in what you're going to do. So 5 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act into place. Now that provided that funding source for acquiring wetlands, protecting wetlands, habitat work. And the first stamp was $1, was the cost of the first stamp there, designed by a gentleman by the name of Ding Darling. That's a common trivia question I hear come up quite often. He's also got a wildlife refuge down in Florida named after him. He was a political cartoonist. I believe he was chief of was it the Biological Survey? I should have written that down. Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, you're spot on. Yeah.
So since 1934, The last figure I could find was over $800 million has been raised from the sale of duck stamps. And about 6 million acres of habitat protected was what I could find. Seemed like numbers varied a little bit, but all hovered around that 6 million acre mark. And the duck stamp program is really cool because by law, 98% of every dollar raised through that program has to go back to, on the ground work, which is kind of an amazing percentage when you think about 98 cents on every dollar. When you purchase your duck stamp, that's going back to wetland habitat. And earlier this year, I think within the last month, there's been a change to the duck stamp when Congress passed the Duck Stamp Modernization Act, which I don't believe it's reached the president's desk yet, but he's expected to sign it. And this will allow e-stamps to be used all season long. So previously you could, if you couldn't get a physical duck stamp in time for your hunt, you could have an e-stamp that you could have, on your phone, have an electronic record of, but it was only good for 45 days. Then you had to have the hard copy one. This will change it to allow that to be used all season long, which I think is great if it gets more people potentially buying duck stamps, more people going hunting. That's all good stuff. So that's a very, very brief history of the duck stamp program. Anything I missed in there before we move on to Pittman Robertson?
I think you pretty well covered it as far as like a brief history of it. So yeah, for sure. That was great.
Awesome. So kind of coming a couple years after the duck stamp, we have the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, or Pittman Robertson Act, 1937. So what that did was it took an excise tax on firearms, ammunition. I don't believe archery equipment was included originally, but it is now. And that money goes to, basically it falls under the Department of the Interior and is then distributed out to the states. So it's kind of dependent on a couple of factors: hunting license sales and the size of the state. That dictates who gets what money. So if a state has more hunters, sells more hunting licenses, they get more money to help those hunters out. It's kind of a cool system where the more hunters you have, the more money that goes into wildlife conservation. Hopefully the more hunters you have, the more game species, right? We know that happens sometimes as game populations rise and fall. You hear it with, I always think of like pheasant hunters. Hey, what are the bird counts? Man, South Dakota's really good this year. A lot of people are going there. The bird counts aren't as good. They might not sell as many licenses. So it's a good system there. There's a companion act on the fish side. We won't get into it as much, but it's the Federal Aid and Sport Fish Restoration Act, or the Dingell-Johnson Act. Was passed. It was basically modeled on Pittman Robertson because it was so successful. So this was in 1950, and that's taxes on fishing equipment, boat gas, a couple other things like import duties on like some boats, electric outboard motors, stuff like that. But a very similar type of program on the fish and water side of things. So we talked about money being distributed to the states, and it's pretty well protected money, meaning it has to be used for a specific purpose, for benefiting hunters and for benefiting wildlife. States will submit their proposals for, this is a land acquisition we want to do, this is a research, we need to research this population of animals. There's a bunch of different things that they can submit proposals for, and then they put the money up for it, and then they get reimbursed. I believe it's like 75% of what they put up. So it's like 25% comes from the states, up to 75% comes from the feds, from Department of Interior. If for some reason that money doesn't get spent, after 2 years, it goes to the Migratory Bird Conservation Act. So kind of back to the duck stamp program, that same kind of funding. So these two sources are linked. And so it's really cool that there's the incentive that if a state is taking hunting license sales, those funds, and putting them, if they try to divert them to something else, they would try to divert them to the general fund or to help some other need in the state, then they would lose the Pittman Robertson funding. So they have this interest in, this is money coming from hunters. It needs to stay, or hunters and shooters, I should say, because it's ammunition and firearms. It's not just hunters. I don't want to, make it seem like it's just the one group, but it's kind of protected so that it can't be diverted and taken away. I haven't read up on it yet, but I think there's some concerns in Pennsylvania right now that there's talks of using some of their money, their hunting dollars, to go to something else. I probably shouldn't even mention it because I'm not an expert on it, but they're worried that the hunters in the state are worried that if this money gets diverted by the legislature, that they may lose all or some of their Pittman Robertson funding. So it's a substantial amount of money. It's in the over $1 billion has been raised. And if you can imagine, over the last few years, if you've had trouble finding ammunition on shelves or trouble purchasing a new firearm, you know that demand has been very high over the past 3, 4, 5 years. So it's frustrating, on one side, if you're not able to find the ammunition you want or, buy the new shotgun you've had your eye on. But the silver lining is, the more guns and ammo that are sold, the more funding, goes into that coffer and then gets distributed to the states. I see Paul mentioned something in the chat there on HB 1300 in Pennsylvania. So that's the name of the bill there. Thank you. So kind of a high level overview of the duck stamp and Pittman Robertson. Anything Pittman Robertson, Kyle, that's kind of your world, that we should mention as well.
Yeah, I think you hit the major points. I was just writing down, look into Pennsylvania HB 1300 and keep eyes on that and see what that's about. But no, that's a great overview. And if you need a job, let me know.
I'll keep you in mind. So Kyle, in your work with, Fish and Wildlife Service, from your end, how do you see, I'm trying to find a way to describe it, but you've been part of projects that use Pittman Robertson funding, stuff like that. Do you have any, maybe a project or something that stands out to you, or something recently that was done, that you might want to talk about?
Yeah, I think just a brief introduction of my role. I work regionally in what our Midwest region. We call it Great Lakes Region 3. You might hear referred to. That's Fish and Wildlife Service wide. I work in a program called the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, and we deal with Pittman Robertson, we deal with Dingell Johnson, and we deal with 12 or 13 other grant programs, going out to states, NGOs to conserve wildlife. So I get that big holistic scope of 8 states here in the Midwest, and I have counterparts in other regions and in our headquarters office in DC that also have a great perspective of things. So I'm not as familiar with other parts of the country, what they're up to and how they're doing their work. We meet pretty regularly, but every state is different. Every circumstance is different, and our job is basically to get that money out the door, right? That's why these grant programs exist. That money is put on the ground, and it benefits wildlife, benefits hunters, it benefits any outdoor recreationist, really, clean water, clean air, you name it. But it's really geared towards hunting, and then Dingell Johnson's really geared towards fishing, obviously, and boating. So the projects I like, I'm a wildlife biologist by training. So there's always like these really cool research projects going on with a lot of game species. Black bears is one of them. I got to have the opportunity in Missouri a few years ago to climb into a den and check up on a sow black bear and some of the work they're doing there to restore black bear populations. Elk population restoration in the Midwest is awesome. That we're it's not the West, but we're getting elk, stable populations and growing populations of elk across the Midwest. But my favorite projects are always land acquisitions. I grew up in Ohio. It's not the most land rich state, as you can imagine. A lot of agriculture, a lot of industry, great state, but areas to hunt and fish are not immensely common, and they can get some crowding and things. So live in Minnesota now, it's a totally different story, like 7 million plus acres of public land. So but land acquisitions, we can't do, in my opinion, anything more important for wildlife conservation, for hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation than buy land, because that's a commodity that is finite. And when we can snatch it up, we need to do so.
So on your end of things, how does a land acquisition, what does that process kind of look like? If you could run us through a brief kind of start to finish.
Yeah, and you touched on some of this. Every year the states are notified about how much money they're going to have apportioned to them through the Pittman Robertson program for that next federal fiscal year. From that pot, they are making business decisions. Any state game agency is making business decisions on how they want to spend that money. Pittman Robertson is different than other grant programs because it's a permanent source of funding. It's in what we call permanent and indefinite. So because it's funded through those excise taxes, not apportioned through Congress, it is money that's always being generated, always coming, and always going back to the states for conservation work. So on my end, on the federal end, I basically receive grant applications from the state fish and wildlife agencies, in which they are stating the need for this grant purpose. For land acquisition, we need to acquire so many acres of land for public hunting and wildlife conservation. They're explaining the benefits of that, kind of the timelines and the budgets and all that kind of grant talk, right? We're still governed by other federal grant law too, but and we are then reviewing that grant application. We're checking that up against other federal laws. Some of the main ones we deal with are the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and then National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, which is protecting cultural resources, historic buildings, historic sites, that kind of thing. So we check off that compliance. We look over the grant package, get everything together, and then sign off on that grant. I mean, that's the short of it. But it's kind of just a digital paperwork exercise. But that's how we see it up front, and then kind of the back end of that is going to the states and reviewing their work.
Super interesting. So everything gets, approved on your end, states given, yep, go ahead with this land acquisition. My lights just turned off here because we have automatic timers, but we'll roll with it. So if I'm a person right now who's, shameless plug, looking at their onX map, are these land acquisitions, are they typically then going to be, what do they become if I'm looking on my map? Are we talking like waterfowl production areas, wildlife management areas? Does it become Forest Service, or what kind of land does it become then?
So the land is purchased by the state Fish and Wildlife Agency. And as you mentioned, the funding is protected both federally. The states can't misuse these apportionments of Pittman Robertson, but license fees on the state side are also protected. The states have to pass protections from hunting license and fishing license fees that they can't be diverted for other uses. We kind of briefly touched on that. And that's really the main source of the state match of the grant. That 25% that the state has to come up with to match the grant is coming from license fees from hunters. So the mixture of federal and state dollars goes into what will become a wildlife management area.
Okay.
And that's typically what they're called in most states. Some states call them conservation areas or game areas or a variety of other things. But
Yeah, I think I've seen
they're
some like a
state
game
land. They're vested
production
with the
area.
state.
I'm sorry I
Yep.
interrupted you. We've got a bit of a delay here.
Nope, you're good. You're good. Yeah, it's just state land. It's going to show up on your onX maps. Update those things, and those new lands should be popping up.
Very cool. And those lands were previously private in most or all cases, and it typically, the ones I'm familiar with would be, say a family that has a farm and they want it to stay, or return to wildlife habitat, and they'll work with sometimes an NGO like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, groups like that, and then kind of work to get that ball rolling of, yep, we're going to take this proposal to the state. Is that kind of how a lot of these go at the very beginning?
Yeah, it's a lot of you know, ear to the ground type work, right? There's wildlife managers in the field, people that work for that state agency that are looking to acquire land constantly, and getting the idea of that family farm potentially becoming available. They want to sell it, for a variety of reasons, right? And they are then kind of proposing that as an acquisition to their decision makers, and then that comes to us for approval through the grant process. So we're seeing a lot of that. I think talking about duck stamps with Sam here in a little bit, there's agricultural areas that are being turned back into native areas, and restoration efforts, getting the wetlands back in there, getting the upland prairies back in there, that kind of thing. But it could be forested, it could be a variety of places. So yeah, it really, like I said, it's one of the most important things we do, and if it's valuable to the state, they're smart people. They're making good, wise decisions on how to spend these apportionments on behalf of their hunting public, and they're getting these areas posted and open to the public for hunting. So
Awesome. Yeah, and that's one thing I do want to mention. We sometimes, people think government and automatically think bad stuff. This isn't like the state DNR is going to come in and eminent domain some family farm, or it's willing seller, willing buyer, on both sides of these things. So it's not like the heavy-handed government coming down
right.
on the neighborhood farmer or anything, which I think most people understand that, but felt worth mentioning.
Yeah, we love maintaining those, obviously those local relationships between the DNR, Game and Fish, and the local community are essential to the conservation in general. But we're not going to come in and swipe it out from underneath somebody, and we want that willing seller, willing buyer relationship.
Yeah. And if we're talking, we kind of talk about farmland or grasslands, talk about a kind of a changing landscape in North America. I think I've heard it, a number of times, that native grasslands are like the most endangered ecosystem, not just in America, but in the world. Like everybody knows about, the rainforest and deforestation, but grasslands we've got single digit percent, like 1% of our native grasslands remaining, because that's good egg country. That's good. That's where we grow our crops. That's where we grow our food. So any little bit of that you can protect and preserve is huge. And farmland is, as the small family farms are kind of fading away, unfortunately, and getting bought up by, larger entities or corporations. A lot of times those are areas that you used to be able to go knock on Farmer Joe's door and, hey, can we go duck hunting in your pond, or can we go, push the slough for pheasants? When it's not the local landowner anymore, it's harder to get hunting permission a lot of times. So if it could potentially become a WMA or something, can preserve hunting access in an area that might not otherwise have very much of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the landscape is changing. It's constantly changing, but it's fairly drastic right now about ownership and size of parcels and things like that are all kind of changing. And I just want to touch on that WMAs are part of that system of conservation areas. It could be waterfowl production areas, national wildlife refuges, both state, federal owned, NGO owned land, that are working in that complex, and especially for migratory birds. It's obviously very important. Fish and Wildlife Service, migratory birds are one of our main things. So having that network of both public and private conservation lands is extremely important.
So you mentioned private lands. In your work, do you do much on the private land side of things, or not so much?
We do. I would say the majority of what we do is the public land side of things, but we do fund technical assistance to private landowners that want to restore their areas. We can provide them some financial assistance as well. Getting those experts, whether it's someone that works for the state or someone who works for Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk, NWTF, etc. I can't name all the NGOs now, but if you're left out, it's not on purpose. But provide them technical assistance, the expertise on how to restore their property, and then potentially provide them funding assistance as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, in some states, if you're not working on private lands, I think of a state. I grew up in Minnesota, so quite a bit of public land there. But a state like Iowa, not a ton of public land available. So if you're only working on public, that's a pretty small piece of the wildlife pie that you're potentially affecting there.
Right. Yeah, and we have a great it's called Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. That's private lands biologists for the Fish and Wildlife Service in each state, but also state counterparts, and like I said, all those NGOs. So you can't be successful in conservation without private lands as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, even in a state like Montana that I now live in, people think of us as a public land state. We're still 2/3 private land. That's still the biggest chunk of the state of Montana. And of course, the private lands, it's a lot of the people settled where the water was, especially in the eastern part of the state. That's where a lot of the wildlife is too. So,
yeah, we also fund a lot of access for private land. So your walk-in access, like in Minnesota, or I don't know how each state does it or what it's called. I know you have like the block management systems and things out in Montana, but providing some incentives to private landowners to provide public access for hunting.
Yeah, I take advantage of that every year. I hunt different block management areas, and the walk-in access in Minnesota is brand new program. I don't think that was really a program when I was growing up there. I think it's only a few years old.
Yeah, I think it's like maybe 10. I shouldn't say. I think it's at least 10 years old, but yeah, relatively new, and they keep adding new accesses and new parcels every year, which is fantastic.
I should have it pulled up. I didn't know we were going to get here, but we just did a walk-in report at onX highlighting how many millions and millions of acres are opened every year in Montana alone, which Montana has the most acreage, partly because we're the fourth biggest state, and partly because we have a pretty old program. Block management's been around a while, but I think in Montana it's 6 or 7 million acres that it opens up.
Nice.
And then other states from there. So it's pretty substantial for sure.
Yeah.
Sam, let's talk duck stamp a little bit. Well, let's back up a little bit. You just did a pretty sweet walk.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, just finished up the 100-mile prairie pothole duck ruck. So anybody watching that didn't catch it on all the channels when we were doing it and follow along, basically started in North Dakota, started southwest of Fargo about an hour or so, and started at a waterfowl production area because really wanted to highlight where those duck stamp dollars are going and what that funds, and ended up walking south and west for 3 days and covered 100 miles and ended up at the Sand Lake National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota. So got to cover 2 states, and right now we're sitting at the whole goal of the project was to try to raise $100,000, 100 miles, 100 grand. All the numbers sounded nice. And then with 100% of the money we raise, we go buy federal duck stamps. So it's a way to basically make sure that all of that money is going back to the ground. So right now we're at 48,515 the last I checked. So yeah, a good start, as my dad would say.
And I just posted the link to the website, to the Duck Ruck there. So if anybody in the chat wants to take a look at that and, donate some money to that effort, or, buy a shirt or hat or something from Sam, his website's linked there. So I think that's super cool. That's a great program. And, like you said, what a great way to raise money that is going to be used wisely. Like by law, 98% of all the money you raise to buy stamps, that's going to go to on the ground work.
Yeah, well, we've been doing the Stamp It Forward project is what we call it. This was just a different twist on that, but we started it in 2019. And my older brother and I, who own Public Land Tees together, we actually did a live the other night, and I kind of totaled up how many stamps we've bought since 2019 and how much money we've raised. And it was, now I'm probably gonna get it wrong, but it was like 7,690 stamps that we've raised money to buy. So pretty pumped about that over the last few years, to be able to know that much money is going back to the ground, and add more grasslands, add more wetlands, add more nesting habitat for everything we love to chase. And I think one of the coolest things about the duck stamp is not only does it help migratory bird species, and this is really one of the things that kind of helped our decision into like leveraging this conservation program that already exists, is because it goes so far beyond ducks and other migratory bird species. So it overall, between plants and animals, it basically, wetlands take care of 700 species overall, including humans. I mean, it's good for water quality, soil erosion, flood control, and then obviously deer, elk, bears, quail, grouse, pheasants, ducks, geese, you name it. If you can think of an animal, it probably uses a wetland somewhere. So it's a very cool government program, a highly efficient program. And then on top of it, helping so much, I think the cool thing is how easy it is to like basically be involved in it. Like, you don't have to be a member of something. You don't have to have a hunting license. You don't need to literally all you have to do is go buy a duck stamp, and that all that money is going directly to conservation. So it's a very easy project or program to try to educate people on, because once people get it and they really see it and they go, oh, well, I don't even duck hunt, but I might as well buy one because I know it's going to add more deer to the landscape, or it's going to add more. I love pheasant hunting, I love quail hunting, all that stuff. It's a pretty easy shift in mindset once you realize what it actually does.
Yeah, I've heard of people even using them as gifts. Like, all the grandkids are getting a duck stamp, and their Christmas present this year. Every birthday card has a duck stamp or something in it. And, besides that, they're just beautiful. It's a sweet little piece of artwork you get to carry around too.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that you didn't touch on when you did the overview of the duck stamp itself, is how the duck stamp gets chosen. So every year, and in the first few years, they just hired people out to, Ding Darling did the first one. And then it was just they just found people to do the first few. I don't remember the year that the duck stamp contest started. But actually it just wrapped up again. So the 2024 stamp was chosen. But it's cool. Every year there's, a pile of submissions, and then they have judges, and they have a panel of judges that go through the art, and they do a live feed and choosing the next year's artwork. There's a really cool documentary called The $1 Million Duck. And it's all about the duck stamp contest, and it focuses a lot on several different artists, but there's a set of brothers that are the winningest duck stamp artists in history. The Houtman brothers out of Minnesota. I'm going to get this wrong, but I think collectively they've won the duck stamp contest 16 or 17 times or something like that. So it's a crazy amount of wins, but it's a very cool way to, choose this artwork for a piece of conservation. And so every year, like you said, it's a collector's item. And I think one of the cool things that we do through Public Land Tees is, so part of the Stamp It Forward project is we raise all the money, we buy all the duck stamps. Well, then the fun part starts. We start giving away duck stamps with every single item we sell. And a lot of people will go to our website and they'll buy 3-4 shirts. Well, then they get 3 or 4 duck stamps. And the stories that we get back from that is super cool. So, we've had people, everything from like, I have a neighbor who just likes watching birds, and like, I got 3 shirts, I got 3 duck stamps. I went and gave her one and explained to her like what these dollars do, and we get a ton of messages from people that are like, my uncle hasn't duck hunted with us in 15 years, but I bought, a cup or a shirt or whatever and got an extra duck stamp. I already had one. I gave it to him, and now he went duck hunting with me this fall, and he hasn't been in the blind, since 1996 or whatever. So it's a very cool way to like, I don't know, kind of increase camaraderie back in the duck blind and get people back into it.
Yeah, that's super cool. We have had a couple of questions on the duck stamp in here. We might as well get to. Casey asked, so 98 cents on every dollar goes to on the ground. Where are the other 2 cents going to? I have an idea, but you probably know better than I do, Sam.
I'm pretty positive it just goes to covering the cost of printing the actual stamp.
Yep. Yeah, printing them and getting them out to post offices and stuff like that, I'm sure. Yep. Good question, though. Definitely good to ask about that. And I know a lot of non-hunters purchase duck stamps as well, birding enthusiasts, people that know the importance of it. I know on some refuges, it's kind of like your admission. It's required to have a duck stamp to, recreate on some properties. I don't know for sure. Do either of you guys have an idea of what percentage of stamps are purchased by non-hunters? I think that might be tough because there's not really a survey when you purchase it, but if there's any estimates.
I'm not sure, but I know it's very low. It's definitely, because after you turn 16, you legally have to have a duck stamp to go waterfowl hunting. So it's definitely by far in bulk hunters that are buying them. But, kind of part of the Stamp It Forward project, and the reason we're doing stuff like this is try to educate people that even if you don't waterfowl hunt, it's a very simple ask. It's a very simple, like, kind of get people to like kind of jump over that ledge a little bit into conservation, whether you only deer hunt or elk hunt or whatever. So
yeah, definitely the lion's share are purchased by hunters, by duck hunters. And like you said, I never purchased a duck stamp until a few years ago when I started duck hunting, and mostly because I just didn't know a whole lot about the duck stamp program. I'm members of different NGOs, a lot of which have been mentioned here, and like to donate to conservation, but I was never like, oh, I should go buy a duck stamp, even if I'm not going duck hunting.
Right.
I like to, there's a wildlife refuge south of Missoula here that I've deer hunted on. Don't need a duck stamp to do that, but I should have been buying duck stamps this whole time. So I think it is, even for people that are lifelong hunters, maybe didn't grow up waterfowl hunting, to kind of get that message out there of, man, even if you're not duck or goose hunting or something, go buy one. It's $25 and does a lot of good work.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I want to touch on is just through the years how the funding from the duck stamp has evolved. So originally did another podcast a while back, the On the Wing podcast, and we had somebody else from U.S. Fish and Wildlife talking about the duck stamp more specifically, and how originally all of the money went to the refuge system. So all of that was funneled into creating and expanding the National Refuge System. And then a guy named Bob Stoughton at the Waubay National Wildlife Refuge, he actually basically, started screaming that they needed to add more parcels to this. So it was kind of his brainchild where the waterfowl production areas came in. And so it's, they call it, it's like small parcel acquisition, but it's, it can be anywhere from 40 to, several thousand acres of, waterfowl production area. But it was a way to basically expand those lands into a lot of the grasslands and uplands where all of the breeding and nesting actually happens. But on top of that, it opens up tons of public access. So, Kyle touched on it with just like acquiring land to open up to the public. That's, a lot of those duck stamp dollars do that now. And, as more people buy more duck stamps, we can buy, or the government can buy more land. And, the relationship there with, let's say each year it's trying to think, it's like about 1 million duck stamps get sold. Something like that. Yeah, roughly 1 million over the last few years. If everybody that spent time outdoors and hunted would buy more duck stamps, we can purchase more land. And then the federal government works with people like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl, because they're able to move faster on these good relationships with willing seller, willing buyer. The NGOs are able to move quicker and purchase that land. And then as the wheels of big government turn, they can get reimbursed for that property, and then it gets turned into waterfowl production area. So it's become this really cool ecosystem between the federal government and nonprofits, working together and create, like Kyle was talking about, creating those relationships with the local landowners, and really developing areas and having a list of parcels like, okay, this is a very high priority, and like, if there's one down the list that's like, is going to be there at some point, like over the next few years. One story, the gentleman told us, he's like, I worked with a landowner for 5 years he kept wanting to sell it. And I was like, you just need to, we're going to get there. I just need you to wait, just to be patient. And they finally, were able to purchase it and turn it into waterfowl production area. So there's a lot of that going on behind the scenes with all of that money raised through duck stamp dollars.
And there's a question here talking about duck stamp dollars. Again, we might have to do some research on this, but how does that money, do you know how it gets doled out? Is it along the lines of like a Pittman Robertson where states get a certain share, or is it, how is that regulated?
Yeah, so I don't know the percentages that each state gets. I know it is broken down a bit into flyways, so they can see where you're purchasing this, or the stamps are getting purchased. So obviously a lot of that money gets spent in the flyways. But a lot of the money ends up getting spent on the prairie pothole region, which extends from Northwest Iowa, up through Western Minnesota, the Eastern Dakotas, some of Nebraska, all the way up into Canada. And the reason a lot of that money gets spent there is because that's the majority of the breeding ground for all waterfowl. So it's like upwards of 70% of all ducks are hatched in the prairie pothole region. So regardless of what flyway you end up hunting, a lot of those birds breed there and then filter into all the flyways. So I would say a good chunk of the money does get spent on the prairie pothole region, just because that's going to have the largest impact on the number of birds in each migration.
Yeah, that makes sense that you're going to spend the duck stamp money where ducks are and where the greatest need is.
Yep.
But I didn't know that I'm buying it in the Pacific Flyway here, that at least a portion of that is
definitely
reserved for the flyway that you're in, which people always like to know that, hey, if I'm spending some money, I want to be able to see a little back and it's not getting spent clear across the country or something.
Yep.
For sure.
Yeah. And Kyle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was going through some of the stuff that Ducks Unlimited had done. And I believe they're able to also basically apply, kind of in the same way with Pittman Robertson, the states apply for like match donations or match grant work. But I think they can use duck stamp dollars for projects that they are working on. So Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl can get access to some of that money if they can move quick on a piece of property or restore habitat. So there's definitely money getting filtered to kind of all the states that are working on it.
Yeah, I think you touched on it pretty strongly. Working for federal government and working very closely with state governments, we're not known for our, how quick we are about any
agility.
So yeah. So having those NGOs out there in the landscape and filling that void that, it just, bureaucracy can grind a little slowly. It takes time to do everything. But if those NGOs can get out there and do that front end work and maintain those relationships, and, they're meeting their mission, they're helping the state, they're helping the federal government, and getting those things acquired. And then, we can then turn around and pay them back for that acquisition.
Yep.
I'm going to post our giveaway link in the chat here real quick as we kind of wrap this up. So everybody that's watching, go down into the chat and click that link. We're giving away some t-shirts, so we got pretty good odds in here. We're giving away 10 shirts tomorrow, so I'll send you an email if you are the winner. We'll get that sent out tomorrow. There was a question in here, Kyle. Maybe you can answer. Has Fish and Wildlife Service ever considered like requiring a duck stamp to enter all refuges? I know we mentioned earlier it was some, but has there ever been a push to say if you're gonna, come and bird watch or recreate or hike on a refuge, you got to have your duck stamp as kind of your admission?
It's something that's been talked about a lot, and you see states doing similar things with hunting licenses, right, on their WMAs. You have to have a valid hunting license to access. Nothing's been, formally proposed for that. That's kind of the system of public lands. We want to support the American public, however they recreate, but with that primary focus on hunters in duck stamps. For sure. So when a waterfowl production area WPA is purchased, is by law open to hunting from the start. So obviously you have to hunt within the season, but it definitely is meant to benefit hunters first, and then other outdoor recreation.
And that's something you just kind of jogged a memory of mine. We at onX, we often get questions from folks like, "Hey, can I hunt here? Can I, not?" Usually it's, can I hunt here? And one thing I heard one time, and tell me if I'm wrong, but so we've got waterfowl production areas and we've got refuges. In waterfowl production area, you kind of assume it's open to hunting unless otherwise notified for maybe there's something going on that it would be closed either temporarily or all the time. And that refuges, you don't necessarily assume they're open to hunting unless told otherwise. Is that kind of a good rule of thumb?
Yep, that is correct. There has been a big movement over the last 4 or 5 years to open more refuge lands to hunting and fishing, and align the regulations there with the state regulations. So there are more and more refuge lands being open. A lot of refuges were also acquired with duck stamps. So it's kind of like Sam talked about. It's kind of, you got some of that money in a variety of ways, but you're spot on. WPA is open unless closed is what we say. Wildlife refuges closed unless open.
Sure. Yeah, and it's I'm just thinking myself, there's a number of WPAs and refuges around here, and there's one that's pretty well known around Missoula that is not open to hunting, which I don't think is a bad thing, because all those ducks probably wouldn't still be there come hunting season if everyone could line the shores of that reservoir and start blasting away. So having some areas closed can benefit hunting, all the surrounding areas for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's a percentage, I think it's 30% of national wildlife refuges that are purchased with duck stamps are what are a migratory bird refuge, if you will. And that there's a portion of that area that's set aside for resting, loafing, and all the other things waterfowl need to do in that area, even during hunting seasons.
Interesting. I did not know that. I think we got one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up. If somebody is looking for like technical assistance to restore a wetland, maybe on a property they own, what's a good resource for them to at least get started down that path?
Yeah, I'll take a short stab at this. There are, a variety of federal resources and state resources and NGO resources that they could go into. So there's no quick answer. I would say the National Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, usually has a county level extension service that will do private land technical assistance. Like I said, in Fish and Wildlife Service, we have private lands biologists, NGOs, Farm Bill biologists, Pheasants Forever, for instance. Ducks Unlimited are great people to work with. And there's also a lot of those people at the state level. So, do a quick Google search on some of those big NGOs, your state and the feds, and see, who's in the area, what what they have available to you, what the cost share, if there's cost share, what that's like. And yeah, there's several ways to fund those and look into those.
Awesome. Yeah, and I bet you reach out, especially some of those NGOs. I think you're going to find some people who are very eager to help. If you have a project you want to work on and something some habitat you want to protect or restore. It's a good question there. Well, gentlemen, I think we've pretty well covered it. For the audience, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully everybody, if I put my old teacher hat on again, hopefully everybody learned something, and then you're kind of a little bit more well equipped to go spread the word of duck stamps and Pittman Robertson to your hunting partners, to your crew that maybe weren't able to watch this here. So thanks again for joining us, Sam, Kyle. Can't thank you enough for hopping on today and helping educate everybody here.
Yeah, and if I can just say one last blurb here, you touched on this. Hunters like to say hunting is conservation, and being able to speak about the duck stamp and Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson and how those fundings go back into natural resources conservation and wildlife is really important, to kind of drive that message home. And then one last thing, we are not able to do what we do through Pittman Robertson without industry support. They're the ones paying the excise taxes. We have a ton of their support. Thank them. When you're buying ammo, you're buying guns, a portion of that is coming back into conservation as well. So you're able to do conservation, be a part of conservation just by, doing what you love, going hunting, buying licenses, buying duck stamps, and buying ammo and guns and whatever else.
Yep. Yeah, if you're a person who does a lot of missing like me, just think of it as you're contributing more to the Pittman Robertson Fund. Silver lining.
That's right. Well, everybody who joined in, thanks for letting me come on here and nerd out about the duck stamp and kind of explain our kind of mission to educate people and do all this stuff. It's, everyone that joined in, like Kyle said, being able to go back to your deer camps or duck camps or, hunting buddies or whatever, and talk about this kind of stuff. To spread these kind of things, it's small ripples, right? The more small ripples we can have makes a much larger effect than just a big splash here and there. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, on that note, I'll wish everybody a good evening. And if your duck season's open or is about to open, hope everybody has some luck this season.